Welcome, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the Qatar Economic Forum. I'm Joanna Ossinger with Bloomberg News, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our panel, Post-Blockchain Identity, What is the Next Generation of Security? So I've got a great panel with me, and hopefully we'll have some good takeaways for you. So let's just get started here. Cybercrime losses are predicted to be up to $6 billion this year. So how might blockchain help secure our data? Naveen, why don't we start with you?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things that could be done. I mean, clearly, with blockchain technologies, traceability and tracking is primary benefit. We've seen with obviously recent attacks on utility grids and in sort of gas distribution and petroleum distribution, whatever you like, all of these kind of critical industries that the ransomware attacks that have taken place have actually relied increasingly on payment through blockchain, through cryptocurrency. And so one of the things that could be done, and there's a question I think we could discuss as a group, is the investigators who are tracing these hackers, because the payments tend to go via the blockchain. Can there be more done, to track down payments and then bring hackers more to the forefront? Because there are obviously lots of, there's a lot of crypto kind of or blockchain explorers who are tracing, who can be traced through this payment mechanism. But then, of course, the whole purpose of crypto is, and the blockchain is also to ensure that if you want to remain, we have to discuss whether the reaches of the law can actually be extended, and this is where I think a lot of things are not really determined yet in the current legislation system. So I think there's a lot that can be done. The question is, how far do we want to take it?
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think Naveen raised an interesting point, and I think the public reporting around the recent pipeline attack that you raised, there was a recovery of funds in that instance. I think the other part of blockchain here is identity and the use of blockchain for secure identity. That now sitting behind that's not something I've seen as widely adopted. And I'd be interested to hear the views of the others around the table as to whether they've seen it in an enterprise environment. But I think the key point there is sitting behind that is public key cryptography. So the blockchain is one part of it. That's the kind of public end that offers you the kind of availability, privacy, convenience, but it's not necessarily inherently secure. So I think in the second part of this question, I don't want to jump forward, but when we talk about the next generation, for me, it's all about the implementation. So sitting behind blockchain is public key cryptography, and it's how well that's implemented. The blockchain in and of itself isn't inherently secure. So that was the point I wanted to add on.
Yeah, post-blockchain, I think we have what exists right now are really good ID cards almost, but it's very binary. Your identity is good or bad. But after this, I think it's going to be more about posture and health, that the identities that are involved and are compromised is less about, are you a valid employee, are you a valid user? It's going to be much more the posture and health. Has your identity been involved in, bad activities in the last while? Have you been sending out, malware and participation of ransomware? And this kind of, posture and health, that's going to be much more important. We have so much volume of storage now and information and telemetry we can collect that we can make really good assessments, whereas today it's kind of good, bad. I think in the future it's going to be a real-time risk assessment for not only systems, identities, devices, but individuals as well.
Yeah, if I could add, maybe just a little bit from a perspective from Visa, and again, from a payments perspective, again, obviously blockchain data security is critical in our space in regards to payments and the credentials that all the cardholders use and merchants that accept. I think beyond the technology, be it blockchain or other technology in regards to actually protect data, I think what we believe is most critical is actually how do we actually devalue that actual information, and that's where we've slowly migrated over the years from static data as in the Max Drive to chip cards where it's dynamic. And then we're also in the e-commerce world moving more and more to tokens, something that is actually going to be that, and we've seen already great use cases. Unfortunately, there is a compromise, but use cases where the actual hackers have been able to go in, forensic companies are able to go in and prove that actually all the data that was stolen are tokens that actually provide no value. So in the future, our goal and my intention as being responsible for protecting the merchants in the CEMEA region for Visa is I don't want them to actually have to protect anything, because I want everything that they actually hold not to have any value, and then really concentrate a very small group of people or entities that actually have valuable information, and then you use multiple different types of technologies to be able to actually secure that data.
I want to comment, Joanna, on Naveen's point on the blockchain and Bitcoin, and certainly the increase of ransomware is mainly attributed to the ease of monetization of these attacks. Like attackers can get paid easier than before. But I think this is not a blockchain problem per se. This is a Bitcoin's problem. Yeah. Because money can be made, but the technology itself is phenomenal in a way that will allow us to do a lot of other activities that weren't available to us before, like the likes of NFTs, the like of integrity verification, and I'm sure probably Alistair had a point in terms of the incident response and collection of forensics evidence. This is, again, if we're going to put them on blockchain and preserve the identity and produce like certificates of like these evidence weren't tampered by anybody, could really help really pointing to the right guys or pointing to the criminals in specifically. And there's also a point about the public key cryptography, which is rightly said by Alistair. But I think here is a blockchain. The phenomenon of blockchain is though the identity plays a big part of it, but the connectedness of the blocks in a certain way that you can trace back to the inception of the blockchain is really phenomenal. That you can really see the changes happened over time. And I think this is what, as Naveen mentioned, in the recent attacks, where law enforcement were able to track payments because of this feature. They can see transactions been made from party A to party B to party C, and they were able to seize and get a control over it. So I think from the outset, I think it will have some significant improvement once the adoption became mainstream over the blockchain.
I think just to kind of chime in on that and add to that as well. Yeah, I think both in terms of what's been discussed about the use of blockchain for processing of payments by cyber criminals and the sort of internal use by identity. The point I'd want to pick up on is that the fundamental challenges remain kind of invariant despite the technologies, right? So with the use of cryptocurrencies and blockchain in processing of payments, it's good old-fashioned money laundering, right? I mean, the technology can be built to be pretty great at traceability, but then people set up tumblers and they find ways to disrupt the flow, and you can't really technologize that kind of risk out. And with the internal identity piece, the same sort of thing, right? Like the weak link is always the identity issuer. There's always some way you can have a wonderfully verifiable distributed framework for identity management. That's fantastic. But the good old-fashioned social engineering manipulation of humans is always going to exist. So I think I was most sort of aligned with what Greg was saying about, I guess, sort of a modest stance of saying that whatever we build with these, it's not an easy solution, and it's a sort of constant, difficult task of verifying in as many ways as you can, being as secure in as many ways as you can, doing as much as you can to constantly revalidate those identities and constantly do everything you can to mitigate risk throughout everything rather than just moments in time for either traceability of transactions or establishing of identity, I think.
Yeah, and absolutely. If I could just agree and sort of re-emphasize on that, because I think one of the things we see is we all here obviously love technology. It's what we do, and we get excited by new technologies. But that adaptability and flexibility is also what we see amongst attackers. So you find some new method of security, they find some new method of undermining it and attacking. And to bring together some of the points from Khalid and Hector and Andrew, if you have the blockchain, that's great, it's immutable. But if you lose your private key, which an attacker might get to by targeting your device through social engineering, then they can impact the blockchain. They effectively take control, and we see attackers using those types of attacks all the time. They understand where the weaknesses sit. And then last point, and I will hand over, but to pick up on the point from Andrew, effectively this sort of strength in depth. Sometimes the term next gen, I think, can be unhelpful. So going back, yes, we love technology, we love the next thing, but I think some people see it as a mental crutch. Oh, I just need the next gen of whatever to solve my problems. And actually, above all else, forget the technologies. Doing the basics well is what's going to matter. So all the things that we've been talking about in the security industry for 5 or 10 years, multi-factor authentication, patching, segmentation, and we can go into more depth about recent attacks and how the lack of patching effectively would have stopped a majority of those, how multi-factor authentication would have stopped a majority of those. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't look at next gen, and we can come on to what we think is the next gen, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't look at blockchain. But if people see this as a mental crutch to move away from those basics, it's never going to solve the problems.
Okay, so actually that gets into something, best practice takeaways from real world incidents. So you mentioned a few of those. What are some takeaways, mistakes that you feel companies made or things that they did well?
I think number one is always to patch and back up. That those two things will stop 99.9% of attacks. But again, attackers realize where the weak points are, and now with approximately $1 out of $6 being spent on technology outside the technology organization, this shadow IT or types of technology that aren't directly controlled by the CIO and other technology leaders. These kinds of new approaches of having better visibility in the organization about what's happening in real time, and especially for devices that can't be managed easily. During the last year, during COVID, with work at home, so many employees and staff were working on shared devices or devices that we would have never trusted before inside our enterprises. And that kind of real-time flexibility and gathering large amounts of data and trying to protect as best we can the stuff we have, but also protecting the stuff that we think we have that we don't control well is going to have to be part of that equation.
Yeah, I would just echo what Alistair and Greg said. I think, from again, when we see the compromises that we see in the payment system, be it what we call ATM cash out attacks or other type of e-commerce compromises, again, it is the basics. Most of the times, one of the things that we're seeing, two growing trends in regards to the fraud space are social engineering, which was also mentioned by Andrew. And so again, one of the things that we are focused on more and more is, again, with that growing move to digital, and with the pandemic, it was just accelerated, is how do we actually do, again, going back to the authentication and identity of who's actually buying the things. The other trend we're seeing significantly, and it continues to be something, is insiders. Insiders continue to play a significant role in regards to being able to be manipulated and sharing credentials in regards to the hackers that we see in the payment system.
Yeah, maybe I can just add, we did a study on this very recently on sort of what were the practices most strongly correlated with overall security resilience, if you like. And the single largest factor was around proactive refreshing of existing technology. I think to the point that was raised by Alistair earlier, it's not just about new technology. It's about what you already have, and just patching and making sure that everything is up to date. I think the other, and that was associated with a 12.7% increase in probability of success. We looked at thousands of companies across the world, and that was through the work that our MFA team did. The other thing is and this is something I just want to kind of throw out there, is that we're constantly surprised, if you like, when an attack happens, but we also, many of us know that attacks are going to happen. So, I think it was John Chambers that said back in 2015, there are two types of companies. There's a company that's been attacked and a company that thinks they haven't been attacked. That everyone's going to get attacked. Basically, everyone is attacked. So I'm just surprised that there's constantly, almost surprised whenever there is an attack, and especially as you start to industrialize and put in place operational technologies together with information technologies, and start to expand your footprint of sensors and edge equipment that is basically connecting to your core, especially in utility industries and other kind of manufacturing industries, where all of a sudden your devices are like expanding like exponentially, and then there is very little information sharing and very little board level oversight, even at the management board level. There's the audit committee, the emphasis on integrating IT strategy and OT strategy as a coordinated strategy as opposed to siloed organizational constructs. So there's lots and lots of things that can be done, and we all know they have to be done. Like threat intelligence sharing should be done, but there's still, and that's what the hackers do all the time. They share their information very, very effectively. So I'm almost like, in a way, just to be provocative, I'm almost like losing a bit of sympathy here, because it's about time actually that some of these practices were put into place.
Anyone want to follow that up?
I guess I'll just add on to that to sort of agree and a little bit challenge it, I guess, which is maybe it's just because I work in the industry, so I'm a bit jaded now. So, and I talk to people who thankfully have got the message that they should expect to, if not having already been attacked, be attacked. But what I find is that the lesson is learned in one domain, and then they make the same mistake of assuming that they'll be secure by design in a new domain. So people I talk to have kind of got the point now that when they're thinking about like on-prem data structure, infrastructure, and old school networked environments, they say things like, yeah, well, obviously it's always possible that there's malware on my systems. But then I talk to them about their DevOps in the cloud, and they say to me, oh no, we follow like an immutable infrastructure pattern, and so it's impossible for our VMs or our containers to be compromised. We don't need to worry about detection because it's secure by design. Or they say the same thing with identity. They say like, our centralized identity provider means that the identity piece isn't a vector for attackers to go after. So I think people do get the message, but there's always this temptation or worry, temptation, not worry, to think that in some new domain, detection and the hard work of constant like log scrutiny and a SOC will somehow not be necessary anymore.
And I'm happy to just jump on that if that's okay for a second. So I think that raises the really interesting point. So having established that foundation, which I think we're all agreed on, that the basics are the important. Andrew mentions a couple of trends, so cloud adoption, but I think also the sort of hybrid environment and remote working. So that's partially been forced by COVID-19, but it's also was a trend that was accelerating anyway. And what that leads to is increased complexity. So it's an increased complexity of your environment, and then interconnection. So, do I authenticate direct to the cloud, or do I authenticate to my network and then back out? So there are a couple of key, next gen, if you like, technologies that I think are going to be key in the next few years. So we've got the things like SASE, so Secure Access Service Edge. And I think we're also going to see a lot more about zero trust. So to Andrew's point, and a lot of the points raised, where you're looking at accessing individual resources, individual systems, individual applications, and there's always a context, a security context around that individual access, and that can be facilitated by SASE, and that also can, helpfully for this subject matter, be linked back to identity and blockchain if you wanted to incorporate that. But the zero trust architecture, I think, is going to be one of the key developments in the near future.
We have these new architectures, and there's good opportunities there. So the zero trust is a great sort of ability to make a smaller petri dish when you look through the microscope with greater telemetry that you're collecting to reduce the attack surface. But I think there's now, with the increase we've seen in the sophistication of the attack groups, that this is no longer the small groups, and the sophistication and the amount of economic impact we're seeing is significant. So there's increasingly a role for governments now, not only to help organizations, especially the small and mid-sized ones, which are the most vulnerable, and small organizations such as state and local governments, but also to cooperate for information sharing and to put more pressure, as we saw in the most recent pipeline attack, on these groups. If there's too much, if they're operating with too much levels of comfort as they are now, operating almost in the light of day, that's a role, I think, for governments and information sharing to happen, and put more pressure not only on the supply of the money that they're changing when they're money laundering, but also on the groups themselves, and put more pressure on them to get out of this business and possibly into something else.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. And I think it goes beyond information sharing. I think that's something that's been developing over a decade. I think we have to get to operational cooperation. So there is an absolute onus on victims. So to not sit back and say, why isn't law enforcement doing something about this? Why isn't government doing something about this? Are you reporting your attacks, and are you cooperating with law enforcement and government agencies? And it becomes extremely complex. So as Greg raises, even criminal attacks, if you look at ransomware and extortion attacks, those are conducted by groups in certain geographies. And for instance, you might see those groups set exclusions in their malware to avoid deploying on Russian language systems, for instance. So a criminal attack has a political element because governments can influence them. But then vice versa, the victims need to cooperate with their law enforcement, and there needs to be a good think at government level about how you conduct investigations and operations that cross borders in every single case.
Okay, so what are governments doing well? Are there any examples you can give of a government that really did something well, or governments that kind of missed an opportunity to help?
So I can speak directly in regards. I'm based here in Dubai and UAE, and in regards to that collaboration with law enforcement and so on and government, we've been working and partnering very closely with the Dubai police in developing a cyber fusion center where there's going to be multiple parties participating from the industry, the financial institutions, the payment networks, and so on. And so that information sharing and collaboration, but also that second step, and I think that's critical. Many times, I think with ransomware, it's a lot more visible, the compromise. But I could tell you from having to deal with compromise over the last 18 years with many of the largest compromises in the U.S., it took us many, many conversations to be able to actually convince that entity that they actually were compromised. Because the first thing that gets in their mind is, how do I actually protect myself and my reputation? And so many times it's denial, denial, denial. And then you have to come with the proof and the evidence to be able to demonstrate. So ransomware is a little bit, very evident. Than other type of data compromises, that's a big challenge. And I think I very agree with Alistair, the fact that people have to take that perspective of, if indeed you are compromised or you believe to be compromised, you have to start acting, and you have to put aside your, how to protect yourself and your potential reputation.
And I can follow up to the question as well, John. I think I agree. I think I was based in the UAE, and the government there, Dubai Police, TDRA, and others, they're doing a lot around this cooperation. There are other governments around the world who are, but they're in pockets. And I think one of the so without then naming a series of other governments, I think one of the key aspects is that multilateral organizations have a significant role to play, because a national government can only do so much when every case, and if I take the most simplistic cyber type case, maybe a cyberbullying, that might happen between two neighbors, but it goes via a server in a third party country, which is where the evidence is sitting. So every cyber case has this international element that crosses borders, and you need evidence collection. So multilateral organizations such as the EU, Europol, Interpol, they all have a significant role to play, and we need to look at how you expedite things like evidence collection across borders.
I want to add a point here, Joanna, especially on the government role. Here in Qatar, there is the host of World Cup 2022. And there has been an effort by the government to secure or to put entities on a tight deadline for them to basically be secure. And this has facilitated a lot of procurement activities and facilitated a lot of guidance to the entities to be there on time. And I think this is what the government can really do, because they can control their constituents. But once it goes across border, it becomes extremely difficult for cooperation, because there are, we know that the internet has been weaponized. There have been attacks attributed to countries to deter different countries. And the internet was built on anonymity. So it's very hard for them to attribute to a certain party or a certain body. And this is a long shot. I think cooperation will certainly take us a long way. Industrially across cooperation will take us a long way, but will not be effective solution, so to speak. I think what the government can really focus on, a priority, is securing their own constituents and making sure that they do their job right. I echo what my colleague said here, like following the basics, like do your patches on time, know what you have, like inventory, and do some basic monitoring that will help you to do these. Will help you to take you a long way across the threat profile. Like some of the threats will be able to find and block, and some you need to really cooperate with others for you to handle. So back again, I think the government can really be much more effective in controlling what they can control, which is their constituents.
We also have standards that are emerging now, or technology we know is coming towards us that we can start to secure now, and governments can take a large role in helping make sure that is good for many countries, not just the technology developers that are making them. So, for example, 6G standards are already starting to emerge, and there's going to be a great divide once quantum crypto becomes an issue. Once we are we all quantum safe? So once quantum computing comes forward, a lot of cryptography is, potentially in danger, and that quantum readiness, we can start looking at that now. In fact, many, governments are doing that. But that's going to be a great divide between the haves and the have-nots, where very advanced countries are going to be ready first and will be smaller targets. And, when that technology changes, in a great shift, there's going to be many countries who may need assistance with that. So once again, technology sharing, but also preparing up front for changes that we know are potentially in the near future.
Yeah, I think maybe one thing I want to add about, I'm not sure which governments are doing this, but I can say what we are lobbying with governments to do to support us on is in like two areas. One is on ensuring appropriate kind of standards across countries, because it's one thing, because cybersecurity is obviously cross-border by nature, right? But so it's all great if one country can set in place proper standards and processes and compliance, which tends to be a focus. But it's not great if the neighboring country doesn't have similar guidance. So that's one issue. The other issue is like when governments think about are thinking about managing the cyber risk, there are so many different domains, and I think just trying to get that across and trying to make that built into directives and legislation is quite important. Like, for example, personal information is one domain that has to be regulated, and that's or has to be enabled to be protected and transparent, and people should have accountability for it. But that's very different to say cybersecurity information or industrial control system data or critical infrastructure, as we've talked about with the pipelines. And then when you start to look at cloud services, supply chain, digital payments, online content, e-commerce, or even like AI, ML, big data, IoT data, it all requires different forms of, they're all different forms of data that need different levels of sophistication in order to protect. So you can protect on a pure infrastructure layer or a network layer, but in many cases, most of the applications, most of the data is being held at the application layer. So we need to look at the data in a very nuanced way, and that's something that I'm not seeing enough thinking, at least cross-border thinking, going on with governments.
Okay, so are there industries that are at greater risk? and what are the solutions, or is kind of everyone at an equal risk?
Well, it's where you get the most disruption, right? I mean, I guess whatever creates the most chaos is probably the most likely industry to be disrupted. So, I mean, if you can disrupt financial sector, or if you can disrupt, energy and oil and gas and power and utility grids, then obviously you'd think that would be the most logical place to go if you were a hacker. But yeah, I don't think it's one or the other. It's also where I think there's also a willingness to pay for ransomware, and and there are some companies that are more willing than less and to pay than others. So it also depends on that as well.
Yeah, I think maybe I kind of take it. I think there's industries and sectors that, let's say, your life or somebody's life is more linked and dependent on. Healthcare, a hospital not being able to take care of people's and their lives, and surgeries or whatever you want to call it, is a little bit more threatening than you can lose. If I look at it from a financial perspective, you can lose a little bit some money, and it could have a financial impact from one point of view, but it's not necessarily a life-threatening industry. So I think there are definitely sectors in industry that have more critical importance to again the government and from different industries.
Yeah, just to kind of join in on that. Obviously, we're all kind of the most concerned about critical infrastructure, and it has been highly targeted recently. But I do think if you look at what happened with the pipeline, DarkSide, the group in that case, did seem to get genuinely spooked by the level of response they provoked from the Biden administration. And if we're thinking about nation state activities, obviously they have all sorts of motives to attack critical infrastructure. But if we're talking about organized crime, they just want to be able to ransom operations, right? And if you can ransom a manufacturing plant or you can ransom a pipeline, it's a very effective way to disrupt services. You're not just relying on data being valuable, but you're disrupting ongoing operations. So that's why that appeals to them. But I think the category of targets that's true of is growing every week. If you think about the way organizations are now structured with remote work, there are so many opportunities now for almost every sector to have their infrastructure disrupted in a way that kills the core function of their business. So if I was a DarkSide or a Sodinokibi or one of these groups, I don't need to go after critical infrastructure that will provoke a governmental response. I can target almost any organization now and disrupt their ability to connect into their centralized infrastructure from their remote workers and potentially achieve similar levels of leverage over organizations for much less inflammatory targets. So I would be concerned about the proliferation of those methods down to SMEs who are now vulnerable with remote working infrastructure in that way.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting dynamic, but I think over the last 12 months, we have seen this pivot where a number of criminal groups have overstepped, as Andrew said, pipeline, healthcare. So you've now got a number of criminal groups publicizing the fact that they will not target healthcare as if that makes them a better criminal, because they're very conscious of this overlap whereby there can be a political reaction to criminal activity. And again, back to Andrew's point, the dynamics here, when you talk about the different verticals, the different industries, they do get extremely complex. There are 5 or 6 industries that feature fairly heavily. Because when you look at nation states, they've got set objectives, they change relatively slowly, and your level of security doesn't impact. So if country X wants to gain access to information on advanced telecommunications, they don't change their mind because it's difficult, they find a new way in. So they're always going to be targeting advanced telecommunications. If you're a criminal, you want the best return on investment. So actually, you're going for the people that can pay, but with the least effort to get in. And that's where, back to your own security, you can have the greatest impact on that type of activity, which can potentially be the most disruptive.
Yeah, I think it's going to change as well. It's going to evolve, absolutely. We've seen in the past where, the price of Bitcoin would drive attacker behavior. For example, they would go more towards using resources when the price of Bitcoin was high rather than ransomware. And we're going to see pivots again. So I think it's very feasible that if some regions have, for example, tax deductions on ransomware payments, or some organizations who have cyber insurance will become greater targets. We're going to see those kinds of evolutions. But I think we're also going to see a change that everybody's a target, and it's continued. It used to be very sort of industry specific or vertical specific, and I think that's gone away now. And I think we're going to see an evolution in targeting.
Okay, so what are some of the most exciting innovations happening in security right now?
I think for me, it's the use of cloud for storage to collect massive amounts of information that we never could collect before in terms of telemetry or information about attacks, to take small breadcrumbs and join them together. Whereas previously we needed, a very small amount of information we're very sure about. So there's new kinds of advances. So XDR is one term that's used for collecting large amounts of telemetry to follow attackers. But I think also new architectures, which was mentioned by Alistair, for example, with zero trust, to change how we're looking at things. So lower the attack surface, which is zero trust, and getting a bigger microscope to look at that smaller petri dish, which is technologies like XDR and related ones to gather more information.
Yeah, I'd like to see. I mean, I'm tracking sort of carefully the developments around passwordless, and context and user context and device context, and how multi-layered security can actually be put in place so that in real time a device, a user, or a workload, a worker, or a workplace can be authenticated in real time, and therefore enabling access to information depending on least privileged rules, right? So I think there's a lot of work being done in that space, and particularly as we all start working all over the place remotely, and as we start to bring on more devices onto networks, it's going to be absolutely critical. Identity has to be correlated, triangulated in real time with a device, with an application, with a user, at lightning speed. So and if you've already been authenticated through biometrics, and that enables you to access other resources with the same levels of permission, then it also improves the user experience and the customer experience of it. So passwordless to me is probably one of the most interesting developments. I'm not saying that it's going to solve everything, but I'm just saying it's very interesting development for the future.
Okay, so go ahead.
So I guess was going to introduce a note of caution, which you'd expect from the security industry. I think with cloud is, again, development's accelerating, very exciting, and we've gone from compute to containers to serverless. But as ever, I think the security framework around that is slightly lagging. So Greg's mentioned XDR. But if you look at EDR, which is a sort of the foundation stone of that, the granularity you can get on an on-premises system or even a virtual machine is now massive. You can get any data you want. If you look at what's available within the cloud, most of the security solutions are primarily around configuration, and actually currently most of the issues are around posture and configuration. But as cloud adoption increases, attacker focus on it will increase, and the level of kind of detail that you need to collect within cloud native solutions will also increase. And I think right now we don't have the number of solutions and the depth of visibility in cloud, and particularly in the kind of extreme end, if you like, the sort of container and serverless that we do anywhere near as we do on premises. So that's going to be a kind of huge development for the security industry.
Okay, so does anyone have advice for the audience here? Anything that you think people really need to be doing, things they need to be thinking about for their companies?
I think to just come off the back of what Alistair was saying there, I'm always very wary, given that I represent a vendor, and giving advice that just sounds like transparently commercial. So to try and not do that, what I would say is, I think the fragmentation of the business across different cloud services is a huge problem. And picking up on what Naveen was saying about tying lots of things together, the idea that we need more maturity in cloud, my one big bit of advice would be to organizations to try and make sure that whatever your security solutions look like, whether it's preventative, detection, response, whatever, to try and do everything you can to reassemble those fragments of the business, if you like, into one consolidated picture, understanding, and like framework of responding to stuff, so that you're dealing with every cloud service environment as part of one strategy. I think that's the biggest challenge that the organizations I work with face. It's just too fragmented at the minute.
I would just say that, as I think early on, I think Alistair, somebody mentioned, authentication is going to be critical, and I think mentioned also, and digital identities are going to be critical, and so I think key areas and things that we think about are again, how do we make sure that every system that is being developed is interoperable, and then there has to be, while there is standards that are created, and like we create many standards in regards to data security, I think a lot of it comes down to the rules and the actual regulations associated with that. So as more of these identity, trusted identity kind of platforms are created, who takes responsibility and liability associated with the different parties and the reliability, and if I'm an entity that's actually identifying an identity provider, and somebody's reliant, who takes that responsibility if the information is incorrect? And so I think that is going to be something that is going to be important as we continue to move to authentication, and identity as being something critical for the future.
Yeah, I'd probably say two things. I mean, not sort of like technology related, but more process related things. One is, I would say, if you've been hacked or if you've been attacked by a cyber criminal, please obviously report it and share as much threat intelligence information that you've picked up with the authorities, or with third parties, or with the vendors who are operating in your environment, so that the more information that you share on the threat, the more intelligence you share, the better it is overall for companies. There's a general, I mean, in this part of the world where I'm in Southeast Asia, there's a general sense of shame, when you've been attacked, and so that is absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. In fact, we're expecting everyone has been attacked already by now, and so that's just a norm. The second thing I would say is go get your if you're a security researcher, or you're a person in the organization that's tasked with protecting the organization, go and ask to meet your management team or the board, and ask them to be trained on security fundamentals. Or even advanced security, or even ask them to be certified in new security technologies themselves. I mean, I don't think it's enough for management teams to manage. I think they need to be also understanding and enforcing policy, and therefore they need to be leading by example and learning about the technology to start with. So that's another thing I would do if I was junior in the organization. And
anyone have any other thoughts? Any last wrap-up comments?
I think what I'm not excited about is any sort of approaches that are going to involve loading up people more, or find anything that's going to require more people to solve it. We've talked about the role of governments. I think that's going to be a great sea change for us. But anything that's going to rely on just bombarding people, just buying a bunch of technology that's going to overload the staff we have already today, that's not the solution. That's like taking too many vitamins. That's not going to work. So instead, these new kinds of approaches, that's going to have to change, because definitely, the threat landscape's changed. The technology landscape is shifting beneath our feet today. And if we don't want more of the same, we're going to have to try different approaches.
I want to add also on my colleague's point. especially on my advice to other security colleagues is basically stick to the basics. Yeah, like do your patches on time, know what you have, make sure you have enough budget for you to launch and do your security program. Don't address this from pure technology perspective, like just buying the latest and greatest technologies and dumping them. Technology is often said as people, technology, process, right? So we need to make sure that we tackle this from all these areas, and this is not a trivial task. Yeah, it is very hard for CISOs to be secure or to give the assurance, but sticking to the basics will take you a long way.
Okay, great. And I think we'll probably need to leave it there. Thank you so much to the audience for listening, and have a great day.